The TeachPitch podcast. We are very excited to be launching a series of interviews for TeachPitch, a global community of 50,000 subscribers from over 205 countries to date. And for these interviews, we have selected a number of subscribers who have achieved great things. And by great, I mean amazing. Think of former presidents, entrepreneurs, people who've built hospitals, huge non-profit organizations, successful journalists, doctors, etc. And what all our guests have in common is that despite their great success, they've encountered many enormous challenges. So what were these challenges and how did they overcome them? That's what we're going to be talking about here. My name is Aldo and I'm massively looking forward and very grateful you can join us on this journey. So sit back, relax and download the podcast here.
Yes, in New Jersey, where I lived, they would have watermelons in stalls on the way to the beach. So, yes, that was a great memory that actually I almost didn't realize was there. And I think that's the wonderful thing about scent and fragrance. It's when you're suddenly confronted by it, then it's an, oh, that's what it is moment, rather than that you're so consciously aware of it all the time. Sometimes that is the key. You just want a nuance or you want a hint of that scent because that is what is going to be the trigger.
In this episode, we speak to our guest what it is like to be one of only a few classically trained female perfumers around, having undergone an extensive training of over 8 years and gained the ability to recognize and remember over 2,000 individual ingredients solely based on smell. We also speak about the difficulties she encountered starting her own company as a creative with a non-business background. And lastly, we talk about the trials and joys of introducing her very own perfume brand in a highly busy and complicated market. Enjoy this interview with Ruth Mastenbroek. The 1985 novel Perfume, or Das Parfum, from the hand of author Patrick Suskind, is one of the best-selling German novels of the 20th century. The title remained on all success lists for about 9 years and received almost unanimously positive national and international critical acclaim. The book was translated into 49 languages and more than 20 million copies were sold worldwide to date. For the movie lovers among us, the book was also made into a fantastic motion picture in 2006, but that as an aside. Now it is true that Perfume has a sinister streak, but I think that's not why it was such a success. The novel fascinated millions of people as it explored the sense of smell and its relationship with the emotional meanings that scents may have. The ability to catch a scent, to define it, to tie it to an emotion, and then having the skill to reproduce and sell it is a true talent that not many people possess. My next guest excels in it. Ruth Mastenbroek has been a perfumer, also dubbed a nose, for over 35 years. She has been commissioned by countless leading scent makers, fashion brands, and even royal houses to create fragrances for men, women, and for the home. Throughout her career, Ruth worked with many names, such as Kenneth Turner and Jigsaw. She was responsible for the Life with a View collection and for the famous grapefruit candle from Jo Malone. Fun fact, the actress Jennifer Lopez loved that candle so much she bought 300 of them for her hotel room. Ruth graduated from Oxford University with a degree in chemistry and started her perfume career as a sales assistant at the perfume department at Selfridges. Her creativity, curiosity and knowledge of the periodic table led her to take on the perfume maker profession in the United Kingdom, the Netherlands and Japan. She was trained at first at a big company, now called Givaudan, and in 2003 decided to start her own fragrance business. Meanwhile, Ruth was also president of the British Society of Perfumers. In 2010, Ruth launched her own niche fragrance collection, her very own signature line to let her imagination run free, giving life to her very own perfumes named Signature, Oxford, Amorosa, Fire Dance, and Dacia. Her fragrances are sold in many famous stores and outlets, such as Fortnum and Mason, and Ruth Mastenbroek Perfumes has grown into a family business as her daughter Claire and son Nick have joined Ruth in making sure that the world can smell at its very best. When reading the descriptions of her perfumes on her website, Ruth herself sounds like quite a storyteller. I don't know much about fragrances, but I guess she's right when she claims that perfumes tell a story over time. Ruth, a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much, Aldo, for your warm welcome. That's lovely to hear my story back to me. It's so many years, but it's gone so fast.
Yeah, well, it's a beautiful story. Let me start with that, Ruth. First question that I have you read the book by Patrick Suskind?
Yes, of course, and seen the film with Dustin Hoffman. And yes, it's fascinating. It doesn't relate completely to my everyday job, but it's still a wonderful story, as you say. Yeah.
Yeah, it is a wonderful story. And of course, the main character is a serial killer, so let's stay away from that. So that's not the association I wanted to bring up by mentioning the book, but I did mention it because for me it's the first time that I associated kind of emotion with smell and where you can find these emotions in kind of daily life. So from a watermelon to lavender to a flower to grass to all these things. I personally had never really thought about that. And I think when reading the book, I was associated with like, hey, that's actually where these scents come from. I don't know why, but it's just, I would not be a good nose, so to say. But that's the first time that I thought, that's where that comes from. That's how all of that ties together.
Well, I think most people don't realize that our sense of smell is so closely related to the limbic system and associations with memories and emotions. And that is definitely something that I've been able to explore as a perfumer.
Yeah, that's good. As a perfumer, am I right in saying that you also have to be a good storyteller?
Well, certainly in my fragrances, I'm using them to tell a story. So, for instance, the story behind the first fragrance of my own brand, Signature, is a story of freedom because, as you described, I was able to use ingredients exactly how I wanted in order to tell that story from almost my childhood through to, so that was in America, and discovering the creek and the wonderful undergrowth in the woods and the smells that reminded me then of an ingredient called patchouli that I discovered so much later. And then the roses of my aunt's garden and wonderful fresh smells, even of Holland from when I was living there. So everything, there is a kind of a thread that goes through from our experience of smells that takes us back in time and triggers some wonderful emotions and memories, and using those also to, I hope, resonate with other people, because I'm hoping that other people can pick up on some of these triggers, I guess, and can also discover something about their past, perhaps, that they can enjoy in a fragrance.
Mm-hmm. But again, I think it's good that you're able to pinpoint, which object or which scent exactly goes with which memory. And then also, being able to bring that to scale. So I was thinking like, what's a strong scent for me? The scent of tobacco or the scent of coffee in combination with the sunlight coming in the kitchen at my father's house. That for me is just a very strong connotation. Now, I don't think I would want a perfume of tobacco and coffee and whatever, but it makes for a good memory. And so I can associate with that, but it's a different thing trying to bottle that and trying to sell it, right? So I think that's something like you need to be able to properly sell that emotion. So I've read somewhere you grew up part of your childhood, I guess, in the United States.
Yes, that's right.
And then you had an association with the scent of watermelons. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, in New Jersey, where I lived, they would sell watermelons in stalls on the way to the beach. So, yes, that was a great memory that actually I almost didn't realize was there. And I think that's the wonderful thing about scent and fragrance. It's when you're suddenly confronted by it, then it's oh, that's what it is moment, rather than that you're so consciously aware of it all the time.
Yeah.
But like you're mentioning, the tobacco and coffee, in fact, I think those would be fantastic. That would be a great combination to make in a fragrance, possibly for a home fragrance, but maybe you don't want to have it so overpowering. And sometimes that is the key. You just want a nuance, or you want a hint of that scent, because that is what is going to be the trigger, not that it's so overpowering, because then, you're going to reject it.
Yeah, that's also true. You don't want to OD on it. You just want it to have as an accent almost lingering around. Yeah, that's a very good point. We're going to look into your challenges in just a minute. I just was curious before we do so, what is it like to work with family? Because you have 2 children in the company. At some point, you started the company with your husband, I believe, as well. So what is that like exactly? What's the experience like?
I think certainly working with my son and daughter now, they are, we all complement each other, and we're able to be honest with each other, and we all are totally devoted to the company and making the most of each of our capabilities and our talents. And so that's something that we have in common as a family, but also as a company. So it's very much win-win, and we get on extremely well. With my husband, there was a little bit more kind of a clash, but that's why, opposites attract, and sometimes then you can get these clashes. But now that Claire and Nick are involved, then yes, we don't have that, and we share ideas. Of course, we sometimes have differences of opinion, but that's only natural and necessary.
I can imagine, but, the role of being a parent and then the role of being colleagues or the role of being siblings, sometimes those might intertwine, but it's very good if you could keep it professional.
Luckily.
Well, that's good. And I'm happy to hear that, if I understand you correctly, that the secret is that everyone kind of develops their own area of expertise within the company. So you don't cross lines too often.
Yes, no, that's right. And especially now I'm training Nick in perfumery, and he's coming along really, really well. So that is involving a lot of memorization of the odor profiles of ingredients. And that's something that Claire doesn't get involved in. She's much more on the sales and marketing side, and it works very well. As you say, it helps to have defined roles.
And then we go to your first challenge, and your first challenge is basically a combination of getting into this world, because it doesn't sound like an easy world to get into. You need to have almost the innate talent to recognize scents, and then in your case you started at Selfridges, but then at some point you were hired and trained by a very big fragrance company, which is now called Givaudan. Could you tell us, first of all, how, because I don't know the market, so how do these companies work? So they make fragrances for all big brands, or how do they operate exactly?
There are 4 huge international manufacturers of fragrances. They create fragrances for most of the big brands. And that's not just, of course, for fine fragrance. It's also for household products. Companies like Unilever and Procter & Gamble, although they do have their own fragrance departments, but the other big names will all use companies like Givaudan, International IFF, International Fragrance and Flavor, Symrise and Firmenich. They are the top 4. But the companies who need them are so big that the manufacturing levels, the quantities are also so big. It means that there's a lot of companies, smaller companies, who need people like me who are prepared to have manufactured smaller quantities of perfume to go into their smaller brands, which can tend to be more local for one country rather than global brands. I mean, as a company, we create fragrances for all kinds of different brands, and from home fragrance to toiletries and fine fragrance. And the size of those companies means they don't want 100 kilos or 100 tons of a fragrance at any time. Then that fragrance is used by those companies as an ingredient to put into their, whatever it might be, skincare or candle. So we are providing a key ingredient, actually. That's what it amounts to. But the scale is not as big as these massive international companies. I hope that's clear.
No, it is. But these massive international companies that you previously worked for, they do this at scale. So they go for, as you said, the 100 kilos. Like, I don't know, for instance, do they also develop the perfumes for Chanel or for these big fashion brands? Or is that all done in-house?
Most companies do not have an in-house perfumer. However, Chanel does. But most companies do not. And then, in fact, they may throw the brief open to 2 or 3 of those big companies. Sometimes they may even ask a smaller company to get a different idea. And so all of those companies will be working towards answering the brief. Maybe it's for, a woman of 40 to 60 who loves sailing and she loves the Caribbean or whatever it might be. Then you'll kind of paint a picture of the style of the fragrance, and then companies will respond to that with their different suggestions, their different developments. So that's the way that I will work on a smaller scale.
Yeah. So that's like a tender. So the big fashion brand
a bit, yeah.
Submits it a bit indeed, yeah, and people can respond to that bit. Okay. So now going to your personal situation when you started your journey, you graduated from Oxford in chemistry. You were creative in nature. You were interested in perfumes. So first you started selling them. Is that correct? It's self-registered?
Well, not exactly. Not exactly.
Oh, okay. So, fake news.
No, when I graduated from Oxford, in fact, I didn't achieve the great degree that I was hoping for. And the way it worked, all of a sudden, although I got my degree, I didn't qualify for the final year. And it meant that at the age of 21, I was now looking for a job, and I decided I didn't want to go into research or teaching, as, I don't know, with a chemistry degree, those were open to me. I mean, these days, people with chemistry degrees go into absolutely everything, banking and IT and law. But anyway, I didn't know what I wanted to do. And in fact, I was on the dole for a couple of weeks. And that was a sobering moment. And I knew whatever, I had to get a job and earn my way. And I was offered a job at Selfridges. And the first department of this grand department store that I worked in was the perfumery department. And I went on an evening course. And that was when the penny dropped that this is what I wanted to do, because at that evening course at the Polytechnic of South London, which no longer exists sadly, but the course showed me all different kinds of ingredients, and I think I could begin to relate my curiosity coming from chemistry about what happens when you make different combinations of molecules, or how do these ingredients, why do they smell different? What happens when you put them together? And the majesty of natural ingredients, essential oils, their complexity, it was absolutely fascinating. And I thought, this is my world. This is what I want to do. I'd started the scent training of more than 2,000 ingredients in England, and I carried on in Holland. And that's where I also had a mentor and a proper kind of training program to go about learning smells in a very ordered and structured way, which is what I'm now trying to introduce Nick to, actually. So that was how it started. And so in a way, it was one door closing and another opening, I suppose.
As it always goes, right?
Yes.
It's never just a linear journey. You somewhat roll into it, but you were inspired and determined to pursue a career in the perfume business. That's definitely.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
And since then, it has never been any different. I wouldn't want to do anything else.
Oh, that's beautiful to hear. And then you started the training, and I've read that the training is quite a steep trajectory. So I've read somewhere you need to be able to recognize and memorize over 2,000 smells. Is that correct?
Yes, it's correct. And it sounds, when you kind of think of that body of ingredients, but because of doing it in a structured way, so you have all of the green notes or the fruity notes or the floral notes, and then the floral ingredients you would then also break down into jasmine and rose and hyacinth or whatever. And then, having learned those individual smells, and so the profile of them, what do they smell like in the beginning, so the top note, and then after a couple of hours the heart note, and then how long does it last on a smelling strip. Having learned those profiles, then you need to know how to start discovering how to put them together to make that rose fragrance. So not just to use rose oil or rose absolute, because those wonderful natural ingredients cost thousands of pounds or dollars. You can't use those in your disinfectant perfume. That has to be cheap. Or you can only use a tiny bit maybe in your skincare fragrance. And so you need to be able to build up that rose fragrance using some synthetic ingredients. It's not just the memory, it's also understanding how to use the ingredients and having the imagination, I think, to try different things, because otherwise your rose is going to smell exactly the same as the next rose. You want everything to have your own stamp.
Yeah. And so this entire course of training takes 7 to 8 years, for you to truly master it. Is that correct? Is that around the time?
Yes. I mean, I'd say probably an absolute minimum of 5 years, but really 7 to 8 years. And it's also just gaining that experience, finding out what happens when I put those couple of ingredients together and how stable is it in that particular application. So you have to think of a perfume, actually, it's got a functional aspect, because it has to, in a bubble bath or a shower gel, it has to burst out of the bottle as a fragrance. It has to smell great when you put hot water on it. And then you want it to last on your skin when you've rinsed off. And even sometimes you want it to smell a little bit when you're dry. So all of those aspects you need to take into account when you're creating the fragrance. Yeah. So it's not just all what we call then these top note ingredients, very volatile ones that only last a few minutes.
Yeah, and I can imagine, and this is also your first challenge, how to combine such expertise knowledge, which also sounds like a very intense career, how to combine that with family life. And at some point it was difficult for you to make both work. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, all the way along in the beginning, in particular, when I started having my family, it was fantastic. I was working at Naarden in Holland, and my husband had the opportunity to go to Japan. And fortunately, there was a unit of Naarden so the company that later became Givaudan, in Yokohama. And so my company agreed I could go and work in Yokohama as a perfumer, which was already fantastic. And then I had to tell them, actually, I mean, I didn't know at the time. Eventually I did, obviously. I'm pregnant. And kind of fingers crossed, was it still all going to be okay? And yes, it was. I could go. And I carried on working there as long as possible. But yes, it wasn't easy. And eventually I worked again when we came back to Holland. But it's not something, at the time, I think there were a dozen or 14 perfumers at Naarden in the head office. And there were 2 other women, perfumers, and myself. And neither of those was married or had children. And I think, in a way, and they had been there previous to me. So, but I think that was the mindset. That was the choice, the career or the family. And they had chosen career. I wanted it all. I wanted to do everything. So at some point I set aside the career, but always wanting to go back. And eventually, when we moved to England and I was able to work for a small company that allowed me to be more flexible and combine that career with having a family. And of course, the ultimate was eventually being able to set up my own business, working from home. And that meant that I had complete control over not only the projects I was working on, but also with my family life and making that combination. So yes, it was a challenge. And these days, I think there are actually more women perfumers. And no doubt in the workplace, the family is taken more into account than it was back then. But, we're talking about a long time ago.
From the outset, you wanted to create your own company, creating your own fragrance business. Is that correct?
Yes, I always had the feeling that I suppose like a writer might think he's got a book inside him. He really wants to write. And I knew I had a fragrance that I needed to express myself in the way that I wanted to, especially to create a fine fragrance. For a lot of my career previously, I was creating fragrances just for all different kinds of products. But fine fragrance, while everything else is a wonderful challenge, fine fragrance is the ultimate.
Well, that's great. That's a great dream, and that's also a great goal to pursue. Could you, just for laymen like myself, what is fine fragrance? Is that a perfume, or what is that exactly?
So yes, fine fragrance is perfume that you would put on your skin. So eau de parfum, eau de toilette. And in a way, although you can tell a story with other fragrances, as we were talking about in the beginning, because of having the top note, the heart note, so the top notes that go very quickly but develop into the heart notes. And so that the fragrance trajectory that is telling a story, but when it's a story that you're wearing on your body all the time and that projects you, it's almost an extension of your image. You recognize that fragrance is one that you want to wear. It's part of you. It's not just something that you are using in your sink or in your house. So it's really key to get that all absolutely lined up. And it was a wonderful moment when I got back to England. That was when I started working in earnest on my fragrance and on the brand. And I guess that was another challenge eventually, to move from creating a fragrance, which is something that I knew about, to bringing in all of those other elements like the packaging and the distribution, the graphics, the pricing, which products should the fragrance go into, all of those kinds of things, and approaching stores. So all of those things that I really didn't know anything about, suddenly, in order to make my dream a reality, also became a reality and a huge challenge.
Yeah, and it is also defined as your second challenge. So how did you go about with not knowing certain things?
Of course, the ideal answer would be listen to people who know more about these things. And I suppose I did do a bit of that. But when you have a really definite idea about something, then you tend to move with that. And of course, you have to, otherwise you're not going to be true to yourself. But it was one of the lessons, I guess, that I did learn from this process, that I probably should have listened more in the beginning to those people who did know more about all of these other aspects. But yes, I have along the way, I have learned. But as I say, I did make a lot of mistakes.
Yeah, no, I recognize it very much, because when I founded Teach Pitch 7 years ago, you first and foremost have the ambition, and you're very focused on trying to achieve that goal, but it's almost a tunnel vision that kind of dilutes a little bit all the interesting people you meet on your path, and these interesting people also have very good advice and very interesting things to say. And on some levels, because you're so focused on just achieving that endpoint, you do not listen to them as well as you should have. That's one of my conclusions, at least, is like, well, you told me this, but I wasn't really listening because I was focused on another element of the business, because there's just so many things you need to take into account, right? So it's almost that the advice comes to you, but you're not always opened up to take the advice for some reason. And only later you realize, like, hey, actually, here's that advice, or here's where I can listen. And yeah, so you do make mistakes on that level. At least I did.
That's the same. That's my experience too. And of course, hindsight is a great thing. I suppose, if nothing else, because you've learned that listening was so crucial, that from this moment on, you will listen more. And I have listened more. And so maybe things go better after that first. I guess that's maybe why, you hear about some companies when they're founded and they go belly up. And but the next company that an entrepreneur starts, then it goes better. Maybe it's because that first company, he wasn't listening, and the second one he did.
Yeah. Could you tell me a little bit about, we just mentioned mistakes. I mean, I can do an entire podcast series about my mistake. But it's not about me, it's about you. Could you give me an example about a mistake that you made in the very beginning of things?
Well, easily. So my initial concept was to surround yourself with the fragrance you love. And I had this one absolutely essential idea for my fragrance, which eventually became the signature fragrance. And I brought it out then in eau de parfum and in bath and body products and candle and diffuser for the home. And I even used microencapsulation of the fragrance in a bathrobe, because then literally you could surround you get out of the bath having used the shower gel and then the body lotion, and then you put on the bathrobe that also smells of Ruth Mastenbroek signature fragrance. And lo and behold, not every shop wanted to take on all of those products. And in a department store, there were different departments that were responsible for, the toiletries or the home fragrance and the fine fragrance, so the eau de parfum. So the look on the shelf that I had been thinking I would be achieving with this vast number of products was totally dissipated. And so I did rather quickly realize that this was not going to be the way forward, and that what I needed to do instead was to concentrate on what I did best, which was creating fragrances. And that's when I worked on the next few fragrances of the line. But that was my biggest initial error, because you can imagine each one of those products needed a development of the product itself, the cost involved, the bottle it went into, the box, the graphics for it, all of that was a cost that I could have avoided if I had actually listened to at least a couple of other people. But I was so determined that this was my concept, and I was not going to be waylaid from that.
Yeah. So lesson learned. So now you're specifically focused on just the fragrances, or how have you solved this mistake moving forward? Yeah.
Well, yes, we no longer have the Bath and Body products in the range. Okay. But this last year, we brought out some candle fragrances that have done very well. And in fact, all the way along, we did retain the fragrance diffusers, because they are using so much fragrance and they're powerful to change the environment of your home. I think that's why they ended up being a success, even though they were sold in different outlets from the fine fragrance. So having started the wrong way, we're kind of gradually going back a little bit to perfuming different products for the brand, understanding who our retailers and who our customers are first.
Yeah, I think that's an important lesson. You know your customer and stay close to your customer if you can, because they at the end decide on the demand, and they can guide you into what's wanted. But that's not always easy, because it's not that they're always very transparent, or it fluctuates or changes for them as well.
Yeah.
And then your third challenge. So we just discussed learning from your mistakes. And not really having the ability to listen, because there are just too many things ongoing, then making that mistake and then trying to correct it so it doesn't affect your business too much. And then the third challenge is actually, okay, then you're there, then you have that fragrance out there, from Oxford to Amoroso to all the other beautiful fragrances you've put out there, and then you need to start selling it. So you need to find the proper distribution channels. And you need to start selling the brand. And that in and of itself is also not an easy task.
Yes, that's right. And so right from the beginning, I needed to have my name recognized, but because my name was on the bottle and the box. And we now have a distributor. That's another area. That's another whole kettle of fish, I suppose. But trying to find the right distributor for a brand, and the right person to do any PR, or the company to do PR. It's a case of kissing a lot of frogs, I think you could say. But we are happy now that we have the right kind of team to move forward.
Yeah. And what was the biggest frog that did not change into a prince?
I would say trying to break through into Harrods. Because having had several meetings and having a lot of hope. I mean, I can remember after one meeting at Harrods, I thought, oh yes, I'm there. And I went round the corner and bought a new dress or something. Just, you have the feeling, oh yes.
To celebrate.
Yes, it was to celebrate. Not that you think that you've got so much money in your pocket, but a little bit, Yeah. And then it fell through. So that was disappointing. Okay. But every time again. And that's talking about that word disappointment. That's something that I guess I began to learn how to deal with, because that and the rejection. So it's very character building. Yeah. But it was not something that I'd ever really had to face so much before. Not to say that everything was all easygoing, but when you get rejected so often, and for me as well, because the perfume in the beginning, in particular the signature perfume, it felt so much a part of me, it was me. So if it was rejected, I was rejected.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So we're now talking about the things that didn't go right, but many things did go well, right? So because you have
yes.
Fortnum and Mason, and you have
Right.
lots of beautiful boutique stores who bought all your 5 fragrances or are selling them. So there are lots of things to be positive about, but it's not an
Yeah.
overnight journey. It takes a lot of hard
No.
work, and it's
Yes.
continuously.
Yes.
I've also been told that now you have a beautiful website, ruthmastenbroek.com, and on there you have also a VIP, very important perfume section, where
Yeah.
people can give their feedback. So where your loyal and fanatic customers can share feedback on the next fragrance or existing products, so that you guys are creating not what you think is right, but what will truly resonate. And I think that's a beautiful thing, and I think that's the way to go, staying very close to your customer.
That's right. I mean, I hadn't realized, but that's in a way what I was just saying then. The VIP system allows us to do that with our customers. And we have said to each other, we only want to ask questions to genuinely find out what they want.
That's good. And has it been useful thus far?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. That's great. That's great to hear. Ruth, what would you say to the next generation of Ruth Mastenbroeks? So a lady coming out of Oxford with a chemistry degree, wanting to get into the perfume business, but then in 2021, what would be your advice to her?
I think what I would suggest to anyone, particularly with that chemistry degree, then get a job with one of the bigger companies so that you can understand what each department does, and probably don't even try to get in. I mean, you can always try, of course, but as a trainee perfumer. But if you can get into quality control, for instance, where you're smelling all of those 2,000 or more ingredients as a matter of course, because of the quality control role, you know, that would already get you a leg up into a possible perfumery course, either with a company or one of the courses that is now available, mostly in France. But yes, so quality control or fragrance evaluation is another area that it can give you a bit more insight, and it would be a bit of getting in by the back door. But because there are so few jobs now in perfumery, and because there are schools, as I say, a lot in France, where I believe it can be it's so competitive, and for people who are not French, it may be even more difficult to get in there. So I would say try to get a job in one of the big perfumery companies, almost doesn't matter what it is, and then get yourself noticed. That's what I would do.
That's great advice. So don't branch out immediately for yourself. First, get the experience you need to become a good nose and build up from there. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's lovely advice. Ruth, thank you so much. We're almost at the end of this interview. I always close off with 2 questions that I ask all my guests. The first question is recommended reading. What are you currently reading, or which book would you recommend our listeners to read? It doesn't have to be professionally related. It could be something that inspired you. I've already mentioned Das Parfum by Patrick Suskind, if you haven't read it yet. But do you have any recommendations?
Oh gosh, that's a really tricky one, Aldo, because since I'm learning Italian, I'm trying to read some Italian books. So I can only, in fact, there is one very interesting author that I've been reading called Jhumpa Lahiri, and she writes in English and in Italian, and she's really very inspirational for having, I mean, can you imagine writing in a language that is not your mother tongue? So her books are very interesting.
Could you give us a title of the book? And could you repeat the author's name? Sorry, I didn't get it.
Yes, it's Jhumpa Lahiri. So it's Jhumpa and then Lahiri. So she was born to Bengalese parents, but lived in America and England, but more recently in Italy in order to get her Italian sufficiently to a level to be able to write in Italian. And the first book that I've read so far is In Altre Parole, which is in other words. And she's recently brought out another book, which in English is called Whereabouts, which has been very well received, I think.
Great recommendation. Jhumpa Lahiri, in other words, or Whereabouts. And then the very last question, Ruth. Now we're going to turn the tables. This is your podcast series. Who would you like to interview? Who should be your guest?
Oh, my. Well, I guess I couldn't help but want to invite a perfumer whom I haven't seen for many years, Olivier Cresp, who created Angel by Thierry Mugler, among other wonderful fragrances. And just to compare notes, he was born into a perfume family, and won't it be great if now Nick, my son, will be able to say that? But it's in Grasse, it's something that happens much more frequently, and it would be just very interesting to compare notes now that we worked together 30 odd years ago, and now again to catch up with him and see how life has treated him. That's what I would like.
Great. Olivier Cresp. Let's set it up. Let's make it happen. For now, I would like to thank you so much for taking us through your journey. If you want to know more about Ruth, you can go to her website, ruthmastenbroek.com. Or you have a beautiful Instagram account, which is Ruth Mastenbroek Perfume. I hope that I have that correctly, where you can follow about all the adventures happening with Ruth Mastenbroek and her family business. So I would highly recommend for people to go and check that out, and we'll be sure to include the links in our show notes. Ruth, thank you so much for talking perfumes, for talking scents, for talking to us about emotions and the entrepreneurial journey that you undertook. It's been a great interview. Come back anytime.
Aldo, it was such a pleasure, and I hope to speak to you again soon.
Thank you very much. Ruth Mastenbroek. If you liked this episode of the Teach Pitch podcast, then it would mean the absolute world if you could share it with your friends and or give it a short review on your preferred podcast platform. The more you share your ideas about these interviews, the more people will find out about them. So do let us know what you think. We'd be very, very grateful.
Special thanks to Kevin MacLeod for our beautiful theme music, Le Grand Chase. This podcast was produced and edited by Natalie Piles. Project coordination by Inva Cheney.